We had a really good time in Kansas City. Stopping by your museum was one of the highlights of our trip. But I thought I'd ask you about other like local museums and places where you can see regionalist painting, because we're going to be talking about Thomas Hart Benton, who's like one of the greatest of the regionalist painters, maybe the greatest. But what other places, Steve, would you recommend people consider visiting in your region of the country?
Well, one thing that, Kansas Cityans are very proud of Kansas City in general. And I think a lot of folks, consider, it's this flyover country, it's really a pretty great city. We've got a lot of culture. The Nelson Atkins Museum of Art here in town is one of the country's best. So it's a great institution. Some of the others that we've got the National World War I Museum here. So if you want to learn about World War I, that's the place to visit. We have a presidential library. Harry S. Truman's library is here. A smaller museum that I really like and recommend to people that some folks aren't as aware of, or you hear and you're just like, I don't know, but it's the National Museum of Toys and Miniatures. And that's really wonderful. So one half of it is all these old toys. And it's funny, you go in and the audience really self-selects. Like, if you're born in the 50s, you're looking at this rack of toys. And if you're born in the 60s, you're looking at this part of the toys and things like that. And then the miniatures, it's all the little miniature rooms and dioramas and stuff with these incredible craftspeople making these little tiny, chest of drawers and little rooms, they're better than doll houses, definitely. And little miniature violins are just, it's incredible. So that one I really recommend. And then the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is down on the 18th and Vine district. And it's a really great institution as well.
Yeah, that's the one of all the ones I missed when I was there. That's the one I really, really need to go to. But the main museum, tell me the name of the biggest art museum there.
The Nelson Atkins.
Nelson Atkins, that is really a fabulous place. Steve, we're going to be back, and I will stop by again at the Thomas Hart Benton home. But I think we're at 1:00, so we'll go ahead and get started. This is Art Viewing Adventures. I'm Rodney Paul. I'm joined by Steve Sitton and Nikki Trasvina from the Community Living Campaign. You're going to tell us kind of about Community Living Campaign and what's all happening there right now.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you, Rodney and Steve and Jennifer. The Community Living Campaign in San Francisco is a nonprofit, and we advocate and provide information about services for seniors and people that are disabled in San Francisco. Of course, we get beyond San Francisco. Today we're coming from Kansas City with Steve, which I'm really excited to hear your presentation. I just absolutely love your background. So anyhow, a Community Living Campaign has a lot of programming online via Zoom and a lot of tech support for seniors and people with disabilities, because we're trying to bridge that technology gap. And if you need help learning about how to use your iPhone, how to use Gmail, just getting more tech savvy as you advance, we're here to help you. So I'll put information about our organization in the chat, but I'm anxious to hear Steve's program. So let's get a move on. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Nikki. And again, Art Viewing Adventures, we're going to be talking about the art of Thomas Hart Benton. And Steve is coming to us from the Thomas Hart Benton Historic Home and Studio. I should have written this down. It's a great place. We want this to be an interactive discussion about the art that Steve's going to be presenting in this topic of Thomas Hart Benton and race. So I will be monitoring chat, but also encouraging you guys when Steve asks questions to unmute, or if you have a question, maybe raise your hand. We'll call on you, and we would love to get your thoughts on the things that Steve's going to be telling us about. So Steve, go ahead and share your presentation. Let's take it away.
Okay, can you see that okay?
I can now, yes.
Okay, let me move a few things out of my way so I can see my own, what I'm doing here. I don't need to see myself. So I do work for Missouri State Parks. The Thomas Hart Benton Home and Studio State Historic Site, there you go, Rodney, is the smallest Missouri State Park. We've got 1/3 of an acre. But the program we're going to be doing today is called Thomas Hart Benton, or Art, Race, and Thomas Hart Benton. And just a fair warning at the beginning. Come on. There we go. So this is a program that does have some sensitive images, topics. So there are some things that you may find disturbing or uncomfortable. If you need to step away for a bit, that is quite understandable. Since we are talking about race and Thomas Hart Benton, his artwork, his activity is mostly a lot of 1930s, 1940s. So there will be some language that, reflects that time period. So just be aware of that. And we'll all try and be very respectful. I also want to let you know too that, I'm a middle-aged white man living in Missouri. These are not always definitely things that I have experienced in my life. So I'm going to try and do the best I can on this sensitive topic. But again, if you have any questions, raise your hand, come on into the chat, those sorts of things. So, okay. But, and I also too want to say that this program, I tried to do it so it's more about education and less about opinions. I'll try not to give a lot of my opinion of what I think about some of these things. Occasionally I will, you can't help it. And I'll start off by saying, using this quote by Thomas Hart Benton, which is a little leading, I think. But Tom Benton said, "We in this country put no stock in racial genius. We do not believe that because a man comes from one racial strain rather than another, he starts with superior equipment. We do not believe this to be true in any field, but particularly in the field of creative endeavor do we repudiate it." So this is something that this artist said in 1940. Do you think this is true? If you want to chime in on that, that's fine. If you just want to think about that in your own head, that's okay too.
Well, I'll just share my thoughts on this statement, which is, you have to put it in the context of its time, right? 1940. And for 1940, this is something that's really, he is in the leading edge of progressive thought, I think, to say this then. To say this today would be a very different thing. So I just think you have to really take that into account. And I know, in 1940, there were a lot of people who were making distinctions among the different races. And there were people who felt like genetics had shown that certain races were superior to others. I'm Jewish myself, and Jews were often thought of as being, racially inferior by some of these people who held these views.
Yeah, I think it is a fairly bold statement, again, for 1940. So that's, just something to keep in mind when we're talking about race and Thomas Hart Benton, that this is something that he at least said in 1940.
Oh, and let me just amplify what Dorothy says in chat. She says, 100% true, but too sad some folks still do not realize it. Yeah, I think that's true too. Like unfortunately, there's still racism in our world today, and we've seen a fair amount of it in recent times. Obviously,
yes. And that's why I wanted to, in the last couple of years, put together this program. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Thomas Hart Benton, his background. We're not going to go all the way through his whole career or anything, because there is a lot to cover on this. But just a little bit of background on Thomas Hart Benton. Here he is at age 3, cute young man. His lifespan is 1889 to 1975. He is born in the small Ozark town of Neosho, Missouri. It's about a 3-hour drive now due south of Kansas City. It's right there in the corner of the state between Oklahoma and Arkansas. Kansas is pretty close as well. So very rural, hilly part of Missouri. If you're not familiar with Thomas Hart Benton, his regionalist art, we've already mentioned that phrase. Here's 2 of his works, these rural scenes, again, 1930s, 1940s especially, and very large murals. He also often did paint African Americans and their labor. And so that's obviously one of the things we're going to cover a lot today. Here's one from 1934 titled Plowing It Under. But some of his ancestral background too, I think, provides some context for this topic. This is the painter's great-great-uncle, Senator Thomas Hart Benton. He was one of Missouri's first two and our longest-serving senator for 30 years, pre-Civil War. He supported things like westward expansion, early homesteading efforts, expansion of the railroads, building of the railroads. He was what is then known as a populist. He represented rural folks, farmers, small town laborers, not the Southern aristocracy, the plantation owners, and not the coming of the factory workers as much either, or the factory owners. It was farmers and laborers for the most part that he represented and supported him. He was a Southerner, born in North Carolina, but he did oppose the expansion of slavery into new territories, Kansas, Nebraska, Oregon, California, things like that. So he would have been called a free soiler, and he felt that slavery threatened the stability of the Union. But he was a slave owner. We do know he freed at least one of his slaves while he served in the U.S. Senate. At the time, and again, keep in mind, at the time, the 1840s, 1850s, he would have been considered a moderate. The extremists were the full abolitionists, who were thought of as radicals, and the full secessionists, who were called the fire eaters. So he was in the middle. We wouldn't consider him a moderate, obviously, anymore, but for the time period, 1840s, 1850s, he would be. The Dred Scott case in 1857, arguably one of the Supreme Court's worst decisions, where a enslaved person, Dred Scott, sued for his freedom because he had been taken into free states, and so he thought that he should be free. The Supreme Court, their decision basically said, well, he's not a citizen, so he doesn't get to bring a suit at all. They didn't even bring up did he get to be free or not? Just he has no right in the courts, essentially. And so Senator Benton then wrote a 190-page challenge and said what a bad decision that was. But back to his opposing slavery expansion into new territories, he said, my personal sentiments then are against the institution of slavery and against its introduction into places in which it does not exist. If there was no slavery in Missouri today, I should oppose its coming in. And he also said the incurability of the evil is the greatest objection to the extension of slavery. I deem it an evil and would neither adopt it nor impose it on others, even though, like I said, he also was a slave owner himself. Then, especially for you folks out in California, you might recognize this early power couple, John and Jessie Fremont. Jessie was the senator's daughter, and she married the famous explorer John C. Fremont. John Fremont became the Republican Party, their brand new party in 1856. He was their first presidential candidate. He had a strong abolitionist platform, but James Buchanan from Pennsylvania was the one that won the presidency. And then obviously the next election, 1860, is when Republican Abe Lincoln was elected. When the Civil War begins, Lincoln appoints Fremont in St. Louis to be commander of the Department of the West, and then Fremont in turn selects General Ulysses S. Grant to go down to Mississippi and capture Vicksburg and the Southern Mississippi River for the Union, for their control. But the Civil War breaks out, starts in April of 1861. In August of 1861, General Fremont frees all the rebel-owned slaves in Missouri. He did not get approval from Lincoln to do this, and so Lincoln fired him. Mm-hmm. So this is the senator, or the painter, excuse me, great aunt and great uncle, step uncle, uncle-in-law, I guess would be. So again, this is part of Thomas Hart Benton's ancestry. And then this gentleman, Macenius E. Benton, this is the painter's father. He was also from Tennessee. He moved to the small town of Neosho, Missouri after the Civil War. He did serve in the Confederate cavalry as a private. His commanding general was Nathan Bedford Forrest, who became the Grand Wizard, first Grand Wizard of the KKK. I don't know how much stock you want to put into this. He's a private. Forrest is the general. They don't really move in the same world. But even so, this was the unit that he served in. Then after the Civil War, he becomes, this is where he gets his nickname, Colonel Benton, in the United Confederate Veterans Organization. And he then moves to Neosho, Missouri, Newton County. He becomes a U.S. district attorney, a lawyer. There was a group down there, vigilantes, who were called the Bald Knobbers. He helped take them down. And he also, one of his big tasks was making sure that veterans, Union veterans of the Civil War, got their pensions. Then when our Tommy is 7 years old, Macenius Benton is elected to the U.S. House of Representatives for 8 years. The family moves to D.C. They do come back to Neosho every summer. He was once called the homeliest man in Congress. He was also a Democrat, like his great uncle, the senator, and again, a populist, working class, rural. And he, no surprise, wanted his son, Tom Benton, to become a lawyer and a politician, following the family business. So that's Tom's ancestry, his background. And then there's this woman, very important in Tom's life, Mariah Watkins. She had been born into slavery. Then she moved to Neosho, Missouri after the Civil War, and she became a highly sought after midwife and nurse for both races. Really interesting, George Washington Carver was her foster son and lived with her in 1877. This is a drawing that George Washington Carver did of the Watkins house with the Neosho Colored School right next door. So she helps raise George Washington Carver, and then in 1889, she is the one that delivered Thomas Hart Benton and was his nanny for the first 5 years of his life. And he says that he's imprinted on his memories just as much as his father or mother. So a pretty influential person in young Tom Benton's life, Aunt Mariah Watkins. While Tom is growing up in the Ozarks in Neosho, there, no surprise, as there were throughout the country, lynchings. Between 1877 and 1950, Missouri lynched 60 African Americans. That's the second highest state outside of the Deep South. And I'm going to focus in on this part of the state, that southwest corner. You can see Neosho circled in yellow there. And we're going to look at an area 50 to 100 miles, about 75 miles around the town of Neosho. And this is just for the years 1889 to 1907, when Tom Benton is growing up in Neosho, the lynchings that occurred. So Robert Hepler in the town of Nevada, Missouri, not Nevada, Nevada out here, January 22nd, 1892. 13 months later, Richard Mays lynched in Springfield, Missouri, the biggest city in that area. A man whose name we don't know, probably just passing through. 11 months later in Verona. Then Ulysses Hayden in Monette, Missouri. No first name, Ward in Galena, Missouri. Then you have William and French Godley in Pierce City. William and French, grandson, grandfather. And then, no surprise, the Godley family left Missouri. They moved to Kansas. And about a year later, William's brother was lynched in Kansas just to make it even more tragic, the Godley brother was lynched on Christmas Day in Pittsburgh, Kansas. But this Pierce City actually was a triple lynching, because Peter Hampton was then killed, murdered after midnight, August 20th. Thomas Gilliard, April 15th, 1903 in Joplin, Missouri. And then you have another triple lynching in Springfield, Horace Duncan, Fred Coker, and again, just after midnight, William Allen, all in Springfield. The last one happened on Benton's 17th birthday. Now, did Tom Benton see any of these lynchings? I doubt it. But remember, his father is a lawyer down there, a district attorney, a congressman. The family certainly would have been aware of many, if not all, of these lynchings. Wouldn't be surprised it was a discussion around the dinner table, things like this. And so these are terrible, terrible events, murders that are happening near Tom Benton's boyhood home, within, like I said, about 75 miles or so. Before the Civil War, there had been some paintings, artwork done that depicted African-American life. Here's a couple of those, 4 of those. I'm not going to go into each of these at all, but notice they all do have a very similar sort of look to them, even though they're all done by separate artists. The one in the bottom left corner, I won't point that out. Winslow Homer, another famous American artist, did dressing for the carnival. So Tom Benton then, once he becomes an artist, begins to paint African-American scenes, include African-American scenes. One of his first ones was in 1925. He had been working on a mural series called American Historical Epic. He wanted to paint about 60 panels for a History of America mural series that no one had asked for. No one ever paid him for it. But one of the scenes was titled Slavery. So he is showing that. Overall, the American Historical Epic mural is kind of about conflict in America, and especially economic conflict. In this slavery scene, I also think it's important to note that there in the background, there is a church. Whether Tom Benton is saying that the church is condoning this, or, or how does this happen in a Christian nation? A lot of slave owners did use the Bible as justification for owning people as well. And then a couple years later, the film Uncle Tom's Cabin was released, and there is a scene in that movie that is almost identical, a mirror image of Tom Benton's painting. Of course, it's also a scene that does appear in the famous novel as well. So this is 1925 that Benton's already painting tragic scenes of slavery. After slavery is abolished, you still have some institutions that are designed to, in some ways, mimic the institution of slavery, hold people down, keep them in check, not give them power. We already mentioned the lynchings, of course, and then also the chain gangs, the prison system. In Tom's autobiography, An Artist in America, 1937, I highly recommend it. He does travel throughout the South, and he does write about chain gangs, as you can see here, and does do artwork depicting chain gangs. This is a little watercolor from 1928. Here's another one, Chain Gang on a Southern Road from 1934. Coming abruptly on a chain gang around some bend in the road, you sort of get a sinking feeling in your chest. It is as if you yourself were under sentence and about to be put in line without hope of appeal or escape. The guards with their guns have a menacing air. You can see the guard there in the background. They look dangerous and merciless. Here's a little painting, Oil on Tin, again, Chain Gang, 1928. The black chain gang, Tom writes, was stretched out along the Orange Road. Where the road dipped ahead, the Negroes were silhouetted against the sky. Their striped pants flopped as they moved their hips. They swung their picks for short side strokes on the red clay roadside. They worked slowly with as little effort as possible. Of course, I would too. At the end of the row, a big strapping husky was singing as he swung his pick. I slowed down to hear what his song was. The guard said, "Move on, you get out of here." But because Tom is from the Ozarks, from a rural background, this did allow him, I think, to move throughout the South, out to these rural areas, to travel, to sketch, to draw, without being viewed as this Yankee carpetbagger artist. So here's 2 of his sketches, New Orleans Market and Oyster House Music. Again, just depicting African-American life. One of the first major American artists to do so, especially on a regular basis. But for Benton, one of the most symbolic images of Black labor in the Deep South were these workers in the cotton fields. So I'm going to show you several of his cotton labor paintings. Keep note of some of the institutions these paintings are at. So the LA County Museum has Cotton Pickers, Georgia. Cotton Pickers at the Art Institute of Chicago. Notice he's doing this in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. Some of these were based on drawings that he'd done back in the 20s, and then Cotton Pickers, 1945, he doesn't come back. He comes back to that sketch and paints it a couple decades later. Cotton picking and loading cotton. So again, if you're in the Deep South and you are going to depict African-American labor, this is certainly one of the scenes you're going to see. And of course, this cotton had to go to market, and in 1928, Tom was on a sketching trip and he heard that there was one last cotton boat on the Mississippi River, the Tennessee Belle. And so he waited on the banks of the Mississippi River at Red River Landing, waiting for this Tennessee Belle boat to arrive. So there you can see the trucks with the bales of cotton waiting on the bank as well. There is the Tennessee Belle, the old stern wheeler steamboat that's pulled up to the dock, and they're loading. And Tom then writes in his autobiography, Negro roustabouts piling over the gangplank from the lower deck of the packet came shouting and whooping up the landing. With grab hooks, they began maneuvering the cotton bales down the steep slope to the boat. This was tricky business, for cotton bales are heavy, and there was but one man to each bale. I know on the St. Louis waterfront in 1910, Negro roustabouts handlers averaged about $65 a month. It was very hard work. These bales, as you can see, are big, they're heavy. If you slip off the gangplank and fall into the water, so be it. Obviously no health insurance if you break your ankle or smash your hand or anything like that. So it's a pretty dangerous work that these guys were doing. But you want to get them on board the boat as fast as you can, the hay bales, so the Tennessee Belle can head on down to its next stop. Once the cotton loading is finished, then Benton actually was invited aboard the boat for dinner. And now the deckhands, the roustabouts, had a little bit of free time, and so they used it to shoot dice. So there's the drawing that he did, and then the painting out of that. So the conditions on the boat for these deckhands, usually they didn't have bunk space. They just kind of slept wherever they could. They'd work really, really hard, really, really fast. Sometimes in the middle of the night, whenever you pulled up to a cotton loading port, and then you just had some downtime until the next port. And then Tom writes, I watched the old packet pull off the landing and make a wide turn down the river. The captain and mates waved to us. We watched the boat until she slipped out of sight around the river bend, fading like the last fringes of memory into the past. Another aspect of African-American life in the Deep South, old-time religion. Tom writes, if anywhere in the world the Christian faith is still touched with the hand of God, it is among the Southern Negroes of the backcountry who cling to traditional ways. They alone set it in unstereotyped beauty. In the old-time services, the shouts of the faithful, punctuating the hymns, are pure, unpremeditated cries to God. So what Benton really is painting in the majority of his artwork is American life, American labor, and he sees the African Americans as a part of that. So he does definitely include it, including the country churches. Then in 1930, he is commissioned to paint a large mural for the New School for Social Research. It's titled America Today. One of the panels is city building. The theme of this mural overall is, again, labor, but also the technology, say, of the 1920s that is transforming labor and society. So there in the city building mural, you can see, the big cranes and the ships and the steam power and the pneumatic drill. But in this one panel, obviously you notice right away the African-American man. And Benton's not just focusing on the technology and the tools, but these workers, their bulging muscles. The African-American figure in this scene, I think he's a little larger than the two white guys. His is the only one whose face you see. The other two are very indeterminate. Even so, at this point, you didn't have much in the way of racially mixed labor crews. Blacks were mostly excluded from union halls. But you do have the Great Migration occurring. The rural South is moving to the urban North. That did create, obviously, a lot of tension as these rural African Americans were moving from the cotton fields, the sugarcane fields, the small towns of the South to places like Chicago and Pittsburgh and DC and LA and Kansas City, for that matter, too. I said at the beginning I wasn't going to input a lot of my own opinion, but I will on this one, Romance from 1931, 1932. This is my personal favorite of every Thomas Hart Benton painting. Obviously shows an African-American couple walking hand in hand in the moonlight, a little log cabin in back. a painting of a young couple in love, holding hands. But when Tom Benton paints this in the early 1930s, because of Jim Crow laws in a lot of places, it actually was illegal for African Americans to show public displays of affection. It was considered gross and inappropriate. And Tom Benton does not make a big deal about it with this painting, but he does show it. He, I think is saying it happens. And a author in 1939 said that to the timeless universal of romantic love, Benton responded with a sensitivity, I cannot say that word, sensitivity, nope, still not getting it, beyond Clayson class and race. This painting actually was owned by the author James Michener, and it is now at the University of Texas Art Museum. Benton also was a teacher. He lived in New York City for 22 years. For quite a bit of that, he taught at the Art Students League, and beginning about 1928, he did have several Black students there. And he said they were my friends and they came because I was painting the Negro. But then one of his white students said Benton and I broke up over his portrayal of the Negroes in the mural he did for the Whitney Museum. This one here, Arts of the South. He said there was a basic anti-humanistic approach that was reflected in all his people. So what is Mervyn Jules talking about here? I think what he's referring to is Benton's treatment of African-American faces. So here's two Benton artworks. It is true that Benton exaggerates facial features. He gives the African-Americans generally wide, flat noses, large lips, things like that. They are exaggerated. But I don't know how much this holds up, because Benton also does this with white faces. There's Portrait of Dan Vincent, an earlier painting. And then this is Portrait of Carl Ruggles, the Sun Treader from 1946. Carl Ruggles actually was a very good friend of Benton's. And Tom said this was the best portrait composition I ever made. So Tom Benton exaggerates everybody's facial features. So I don't think he was singling out the African Americans there. Sorry,
it's basically
Roger.
his style, right?
It is his style, yes. And I think Benton also is following in the tradition of other artists like Gauguin and Matisse, with these unrealistic or exaggerated African-American faces, and even maybe anticipating Picasso, whose faces were certainly not realistic at all. But it was done. And so Tom Benton does this as well. Whether it's right or wrong, we can discuss that. So here's two more drawings that Tom Benton did out in the world. Sharecroppers Cabin, probably in Georgia from 1928, and Southeast Cotton Warehouse from about 1934. When Tom was sketching this Sharecroppers Cabin, he writes about in his autobiography that this guy came out, one of the residents of the house came out on the porch and said, "Sir, I beg your pardon, but my mother thinks you are making fun of her house and wants you to please go away." And Tom went, he left. So he did respect those wishes. But back to the treatment of faces. You can chime in here, think about it to yourself. Are Benton's faces caricatures? Yes or no?
I would really love to invite people in the audience to share your thoughts on this. I can share my own, which is, there's certain quality of caricature in all of his depictions, but to me, I feel like it works, and the charge that the person made against him was that he was anti-humanistic.
Yes.
Maybe it was what we would call dehumanizing today, and I don't get that at all. I feel like these are really, I do get the humanity from the figures I'm seeing, but I'd love to know what their other reactions are to these images that we've been seeing.
Could I say something? This is Peter.
Please do.
There are caricatures on the faces of all the people that he's doing, but there are also caricatures of, like, the cabin that you're showing. It probably wasn't exactly like that. Even the horses in some of the pictures, like, everything is a caricature. It's some of his paintings are almost surreal, the way the landscapes are like curving, and it's going to be a flat field, not with the big lumps in it. that's just my take on what I'm seeing from his work.
Yeah, that's great. Great observation. I'll read what Marcia put in chat. She says he drew at a distance with an observer's eye, not portraits. He wanted to capture equality, not an identity.
I think that's, I may steal that. That's perfect. Yeah, I totally agree. So
Does anybody else want to jump in before we move on? Okay, we'll go ahead, Steve.
okay, so I think we're mostly in agreement that, yeah, they're caricatures in a way. They're exaggerated, certainly. But more importantly, come on, are they mean-spirited?
Right. And yeah, I certainly don't think they are in my mind. You know, I'm sure there were mean-spirited depictions of African Americans from other artists.
Yeah, I think so. So, and Tom says that I've done many pictures of the Southern Negro, which they used to like, but don't anymore. They don't like to be reminded of the inequities which my paintings depicted. They regard as caricatures what I regarded as realistic. Now, he doesn't write this until 1971. And he also says in 1973, I made them not as gentlemen, but as workers. So, you know, take that all as you will.
Anybody else want to share thoughts? Nope. We have a comment in a chat from Northeast. She says, no, since it is his style, mean-spirited would just be one or two. And yes, we saw he also did he did this with his white figures. Yes.
I think so. So like I said, I just wanted to get you guys thinking about this and get some ideas and some opinions. This next painting is going to require some context, so bear with me. This is Minstrel Show from 1934. This painting is now at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art here in town, although they don't usually have it on display. This, again, Tom was out on a sketching trip and he goes to the town of Richlands, Virginia. And a few decades earlier, 5 Black men had been lynched here and the rest of the Black population had been evicted. Now this traveling minstrel group shows up in Richland and they're supposed to perform for this entirely white town. And so Tom Benton attends the Minstrel Show and produces this painting in 1934. As you can well imagine, the performers were nervous. And Tom writes, bravely but frenziedly, they set to jazzing the crowd that gathered about them. The cornet player, his eyes rolling with something far from anticipatory relish of applause, brought prompt roars of laughter. The ludicrousness of his fear, which was proclaimed by his frightened eyes and denied by the painted grin of his thick white lips, worked better than any mummery he could have devised to cool whatever there was in the hot animosity of the townspeople. Sensing fun, suspecting its cause, the Negroes, with the quick adaptability of their race, made the most of it and put on an exaggerated musical pantomime of suspicious fear. So these performers like, okay, we'll really play up being afraid and clowns sort of thing, and then we won't seem threatening to the crowd, hopefully. I don't like personally the way Benton here says he kind of lumps all Negroes together with the quick adaptability of their race. So be it. Tom Benton is certainly not perfect. But then Tom also says that in the night, the 5 famous artists and entertainers slipped away unharmed. They were able to get out of this all-white town. And then a boy in the hotel said to me the next morning, them N-words was all right.
Wow.
So let's look at this painting a little closer. So here it is up close. I like this quote from Jacob Lawrence. He's an African-American artist. He said, this painting's about Black people pretending to be white people who are imitating Black people. Notice, again, back to the faces. Yes, Tom, on the African-Americans does put in the painted lips, the makeup that they were wearing. He exaggerates their facial features. But notice the crowd, who you don't even see their faces at all. They're completely anonymous. Whereas the performers, at least Tom does give them individual faces. The white crowd, Tom exaggerates them. Look at those huge ears. what I also think is pretty telling in this painting is notice the youngest boy who's sitting on the edge of the stage. Something to think about. Is Tom Benton showing this child as kind of bridging that gap? Is Tom Benton saying that, you know, he has hope that the younger generation will be a little more accepting, that there won't be this divide from, you know, the stage and the crowd, that you've got this young boy in the middle? I don't know. Tom Benton didn't say. Something to think about. And again, my personal opinion there.
I'll tell you my thought. I kind of feel like he's looking at them like they're, you know, like they're almost like animals or something. It's a really, I feel like he has that child. It's disturbing to me.
Okay.
The view he's taking. I see Marcia has her hand raised. Go ahead, Marcia.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. I just wanted to chime in that as I'm watching these things and listening to his autobiographical words, I think he did objectify the population around him. He at least would go near them and draw them, and he perhaps had warm association with a nanny early on. But I have yet to see where he crossed into, you know, friendship or honor, right? So he's credited with drawing them, but I don't think he's credited with a pure heart in my mind.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Great observation, Marcia.
And again, in this quote that you see here, he has again lumped everybody together. With, again, the caveat that this is 1937 that he writes this. So, but I think this is a very interesting painting. It is one that you can glance at and, you know, this is offensive, but I think that context, that history of it, is also important to know. Okay, I'm gonna move on.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So we talked at the beginning about lynching. In 1935, the NAACP had a art exhibition about lynching at the Newton Galleries in New York City. There was a movement to make lynching a federal crime. In 1935, the NCAA had this exhibit, like I said. It was a 2-week show. About 3,000 people viewed this show. They included work by 38 artists, including 10 African Americans. What you see there is the cover of the catalog. And also, again, for the context, in 1935, there were 20 reported lynchings in the United States. There certainly may have been more. The New York World Telegram newspaper writes, "This is not an exhibition for softies. It may upset your stomach. If it upsets your complacency on the subject, it will have been successful." So I'll give you that fair warning again. There are some images in this exhibition that are quite disturbing. So if anybody needs to step away for a couple of minutes, that's certainly understandable. So here is one of the paintings, "The Law is Too Slow" by George Bellows. That was obviously one of the justifications for a lot of the lynchings. We don't want to wait for the sheriff or the judge or the jury or the prosecuting attorney. We know this person's guilty of whatever crime they're accused of, so we're going to take the law into our own hands. So the law is too slow.
What's in his hand?
Which one?
The farmer. Rake? Is that a rake? Like he's
it's like a rake, or where he's stirring up the embers of fire, I think. Could be a spear too, where he's poking him. Hard to say.
Something that's not good.
Yeah. This is The Lynching by Julius Block. Kind of very much a crucifix sort of look there as well. Maryland by Edmund Duffy. This is a little sculpture, Dixie Holiday. Looks like the parents or the family has come to visit the murder victim, hanging there. Samuel Brown did Lynching. Samuel Brown was one of the African-American artists in this exhibition. His artwork, this one's, especially the crowd down below, and this is an odd angle. It's a bird's eye view looking down on the victim's face. But look at especially the crowd. They almost look very like cartoons down there. This is a Giddy Up by Hale Woodruff, another African-American artist. This one's a little hard to see. It's a wood cut. But notice down here in the very bottom center, there's a little girl. You can see her braids where she's shaking her fist at the victim. An older woman here also shaking her fist. The title refers to, he's in the back of the wagon when they holler, "Giddy up," the horse will take off, and then he'll be left suspended. And then similar, her first lynching by Reginald Marsh, where the grandmother, assume, is holding up the little girl so that she has a good view of the tragic events. Southern Holiday by Harry Sternberg, again, kind of a crucifix sort of scene. Also the castration, which often did occur as well. Notice in the background of this one too, you have some factories. I think that refers back to that Great Migration, these African Americans moving into the cities where they weren't welcome. And that's where some lynchings definitely occurred, that they have stepped out of their home location and moved into new locations where they weren't welcome. So I think that's what Harry Sternberg is referring to there.
Dorothy notices there's a church in the background too.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Paul Cadmus, To the Lynching, very kind of chaotic look sort of thing to this one. A sculpture by Naguchi, Death, a faceless figure with tortured, twisted, bulging muscles, and then his legs reflectively drawn up away from the fire below, the unseen fire below. A very powerful sculpture, I think. And then Tom Benton did provide an artwork for this, an oil painting titled A Lynching. His was the largest painting in the exhibition. In the lower left corner, you see the three guys with the battering ram trying to break into presumably the jail. And then in the upper right, the victim hung from a telephone pole. Again, those bulging muscles and the legs drawn up away from the fire below. This painting doesn't exist anymore. Tom had a home and studio on Martha's Vineyard, and the painting got water damage, so it's gone, unfortunately. So we don't even have any color images of it. But Tom also, it's called A Lynching, but originally he had titled it A Century of Progress. And this is going to give you a little pause. Let me back up. A couple years earlier in 1933, Tom Benton had painted a huge mural for the state of Indiana at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, titled The Cultural and Industrial Progress of Indiana. Anybody know what that World's Fair was titled, 1933?
No.
A Century of Progress.
Oh.
So Tom Benton does this mural for the Chicago World's Fair, and then the next year he's like, my painting about lynching, I'm going to refer back to that, A Century of Progress. This mural is 22 panels, 12 feet tall, 240 feet long. There you can see it's an original installation. Notice the doors down below to give you an idea of the size. This mural is now at Indiana University. At the time and still today, there is controversy over his depiction of a KKK rally in this mural. But again, some history, some context. In the 1920s, the Klan had about 250,000 Indiana folks as members of the Klan. About half of the state's General Assembly were Klan members or associated, and they also had strong ties to the governor of the state and the mayor of Indianapolis. So the Klan was powerful in Indiana, so Tom Benton showed that. But notice, here's the rest of that same panel, and again, that's 12 feet tall. You do have a Catholic church. You have a white nurse taking care of a black child, and then down at the bottom, you have the newspaper men who showed the role of the Klan in Indiana politics. They were able to get rid of the governor. He didn't win re-election. And so the Klan section, it stands out, but it is a very small portion of this one panel. And even more so, Tom Benton devotes more canvas space to Abe Lincoln. Lincoln's like 9 feet tall in this mural. He shows the Underground Railroad, and he shows Indiana's contribution to the Union during the Civil War. So that Klan scene catches your eye, no doubt about it, catches your eye. But it is one small part of this whole huge mural, 240 feet.
And is it controversial because people felt he might be celebrating the Klan?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Celebrating, and just the fact that he depicted it.
But we wouldn't think he was, knowing his views on race, right?
Probably not. But after the World's Fair closed, the mural was moved to Indiana University, and this panel, you can see there, was placed in a large lecture hall. The professor, like the first day of class, was supposed to give some background. This is what this mural means. But these were math classes, chemistry classes, English classes. These professors weren't necessarily always completely up to speed on the context and the history of the mural. Some of the professors seem to have been like, I don't have time to go into this. We've got a syllabus we need to cover. But I think you can well imagine that this would be uncomfortable for many students. And so there was talk about taking it down, covering it up. In 2017, there was a student petition. It's past time that Indiana University take a stand and denounce hate and intolerance in Indiana and on IU's campus.
Well,
but
yeah,
I need to speed up a little bit. Sorry, Rodney.
that's okay.
But the vice president for diversity said this does not glorify or celebrate this particular dark episode in Indiana, but instead shows the state's past has shameful moments, the likes of which we do not want to see again ever. And the Indiana University provost said this is unquestionably an anti-Klan work. It is intended to expose the Klan's history in Indiana as hateful and corrupt. It does not honor or even memorialize individuals or the organization as a whole. And to cover the mural feels like censorship and runs counter to the intent of the artist to make visible moments in history that some would rather forget. So there was talk, do we cover it up? Do we take it down? What do we do about this? We shouldn't expose the students to this on a daily basis. Indiana University decided that it was too fragile to remove it. So what they did decide to do was they would no longer hold classes in this lecture hall. They still use the room for special events, lectures, special lectures, things like that. But again, then they can get into at the beginning of the lecture, talk about these panels that you see here. 1935, Tom Benton was commissioned to provide a large mural for the Missouri State Capitol in Jeff City. You can see him working right there. That gives you an idea of the size of the mural, although that's just one of the 4 walls. And in this mural for the Missouri State Capitol, he shows the scene of a slave auction. He shows slaves working in a lead mine in Southeast Missouri. He shows a lynching in Civil War era Missouri. He shows African-American woman scrounging for bits of coal during the Great Depression. Did those things happen in Missouri? Yeah, they did. So Tom Benton paints it, and he includes it in the state capitol. But he also showed a scene of a black man and a white man working together. I don't think there's anything in this view that looks like one is subservient to the other. They seem to both be pulling their weight, working together. You may have a different view of that. He showed Huck Finn and Jim on their raft together. He shows the unofficial, his title is the Negro Mayor of St. Louis, Jordan Chambers, watching a Macenius Benton speech. That's Tom Benton's father. And he also paints the Ballad of Frankie and Johnny. And the Kansas City Star, soon after this mural was unveiled, said that certainly artists have never limited their subjects to beauty. They have painted tragic things, ugly things, humdrum things. Paintings with this emotional quality may not be pretty, but if they stand the test of time, they are considered beautiful. And in fact, I think there's a lot of contradiction in this mural. So just this one scene here, notice at the very bottom, you have the Mormons being expelled from Missouri, being tarred and feathered. That did happen in the 1830s. You then have those two white man, black man working together to chop up a log and build a house. You then have behind them on the right-hand side, that slave auction. And in the background, you have a river baptism. Overseeing the whole thing is the St. Louis Basilica and the Missouri State Capitol as well. So a lot of contradiction there. And I don't think Benton's going to allow you to make quick, easy moral judgments about his work.
Steve, I want to jump in. There's
Sure.
Sherry brought up something local,
Okay.
which are the George Washington High School murals in San Francisco, and there's been controversy about them. Sherry says they are anti-slavery and the horrific treatment. They show the horrific treatment of Native Americans. They are meant to teach. Unfortunately, when my son was a freshman, one of his teachers took them on a tour of all the murals in the school. Mm-hmm. I just want to say, we don't need to be taking down what people can see. We need to teach people to learn how to interpret things for themselves.
I think so. And to look at the whole thing, and again, the context and when it was done.
Yeah. So keep going, Steve.
There we go. Again, personal thing. Tom did do a lot of portraits. This is my personal favorite of all his portraits. I said romance was my personal favorite of all his paintings. This is my favorite portrait. Aaron from 1942. Ben Nichols is this guy's name. He had been born into slavery. One of Tom Benton's students met him, brought him into the class so that he could model. I think this is a very tender portrayal. I think it's very sympathetic of this man. I think you can also see the hard life this guy's led. And then Benton renames him Aaron, after the brother of Moses, the biblical prophet. And one of Benton's students said, this must surely rank among the greatest of American portraits. The painting is in the Pennsylvania Academy of Art in Philadelphia. I love this portrait, though. 1942, World War II is going on, and Tom Benton paints Negro Soldier. Again, a couple questions to think about with this one. And again, context. At this time, the armed forces were segregated. Tom Benton had originally called this Soldier of America. But think about, why did Benton paint a black soldier instead of a white one? He very easily could have painted a white soldier. Lots of people were doing that, but Tom Benton chose to paint an African-American soldier. Does this man look brutish? Does he look resolute? Some people say he looks very simian. And again, use that as you know, Tom Benton is making fun of this guy. We can all have our opinions on that. His helmet, does that look a little bit like a halo? And then another bit of context, again, the Negro Soldier title. At this same time, the director Frank Capra was making a recruitment film titled The Negro Soldier to try and get African Americans to join the armed forces. This movie starred Joe Louis, the boxer. And look at that advertisement on the right-hand side. Does Joe Louis look brutish or resolute or even simian? 1947, Tom Benton is commissioned to paint a mural for a department store in downtown Kansas City called Hartsfields. The mural is titled Oculus and Hercules. Since 1984, the mural has been at the Smithsonian. So we'll take a quick look at this one closer up. Again, done for this nice women's department store downtown. African Americans in the 40s could shop at Hartsfields, but they were not allowed to try on clothes because then the clothes would be contaminated and dirty, apparently. Hartsfields did have African American employees, but they were not sales or management. Certainly they were janitorial. They worked in the warehouse. And yet, in this mural in 1947, Benton does include at least one African American man in the mural. You can see him there on the left-hand side. He's climbing over the fence. He's coming onto the field. You have a couple other figures, male figures there where the race is indeterminate. But Benton definitely did include an African American figure in this mural for the women's department store. 2 years later, 1949, he does Portrait of a Musician. And notice in this one, again, exaggerated, certainly, no question about the exaggeration, but I think also the curving lines in that instrument, in that upright bass, are reflected in the guy's hands, in his body, in his face, just like jazz does. And I got a Benton scholar from Minnesota. She said that Benton combines form and content to cast light on the professional skills of an African-American musician, on the sounds and the character of the music he plays, and on his dignity as a Black artist. Back to, I don't remember whose comment this was, that Benton was just portraying African-Americans. Tom and his wife Rita often did invite African-American and Jewish people to their house for dinner and for music. They often would have dinner parties. And in Kansas City, segregated in the 1940s, 1950s, they did get some criticism for this. In 1964, again later, but the Bentons hosted a luau for at their house for the staff of the Truman Library. And so there were several African-American employees that were welcome in the Benton house in 1964 too. So, and his daughter Jessie said that Tom was the most fair person. He had an enormous sense of justice. I can't say that enough. Here's another mural. He does a small mural for Lincoln University. It's a historic Black college in Jefferson City, Missouri. This was painted in 1954-55. Not my favorite Benton painting. I think the link in there is very paternalistic. Tom Benton was going to get paid $12,000 for this mural. Lincoln University had only raised about half of it. They were having trouble coming up with the money. So Tom Benton said, you know what, I'll do this mural for free. Just take that $6,000 or whatever you've raised so far and set up an art scholarship. Tom Benton also paints basically the legend of John Henry, paints it, sculpts it, does it as a lithograph. And then his very last mural is titled Sources of Country Music. And in that mural, he does show a African-American banjo player, a bag of cotton. So it shows the spirituals, the work songs, the minstrel shows as a source of country music. But here's his original drawing for it. And notice that the banjo player is actually even more prominent. And then he moved him into the background in the final mural. Tom also in the final mural included a train and a riverboat as well. But he isn't leaving the African-American influence of country music out. I'm going to skip a couple of these so we can get through. Sorry. There we go. Something else too to keep in mind is that Benton's paintings of the South often were sold to private collectors, galleries in the North. So it's almost like think of like National Geographic, you know, the old National Geographic. You'd see these wonderful photos of places that you had never been or even maybe heard of, and you saved them. So Lonesome Road is in Lincoln, Nebraska. Cotton Bin is in Ithaca, New York. And then I'll finish up with this, and then we'll get a couple minutes for questions. Oprah Winfrey owns 2 Benton paintings. The Water Boy hangs in her home in Maui. Must be nice. And she says about the Water Boy, he's like someone I knew growing up. I bought him because I loved him. And then her other Benton painting is in Santa Barbara, California, back from the fields. So again, that cotton labor scene. And then his autobiography, Tom Benton asked himself a question: what is the most important cultural factor in the South? And he answers it by saying, the colored people, by what they could do in your climate, are the most important cultural factor in the South. They taught you the language by which you express yourself. They made your songs, your jokes, and all else that will stand in your civilization as unique and characterful. They are responsible for the tradition of good life which you have, for without them to do your work, you could not have had that life. And in his America Today mural that he did for the New School for Social Research, here again is his painting, The Deep South. So he's showing lots of labor, cotton pickers, farming, steamboats. There's the Tennessee Belle again, things like that. So we got a few minutes. Sorry I went long, but what questions, what discussions do you have? One other thing, something to think about, and here's 2 examples of it. In many of his paintings of African Americans, Benton's titles were pretty neutral. Yes, he has Negro Soldier, although again, the original title was An American Soldier, but he doesn't, in this one, for example, say Black Man with Cat and Dog, or Black Man Getting a Drink of Water. If you didn't have the image of it, you know, the title would give you no clue of who these people were, what their race was. So I'll stop now. Questions, discussion.
Well, I'll just share a comment and then invite others to chime in. You know, I think the thing that I really want to give Thomas Hart Benton credit for is he depicted Black Americans so frequently. You know, like this was an important body in his work. And, you know, I don't think a lot of other painters were doing that at that time. Here's a question for you, Steve. Grant Wood is a contemporary. I don't think he has the body of work that Thomas Hart Benton does, but does Grant Wood have a lot of depictions of African Americans?
No, he doesn't. And Grant Wood did not have the same body of work. Grant Wood died fairly young in the 1940s. But that is one of my contentions in this program, that Tom Benton is one of the first artists to often depict African American. I can't tell you what percentage of his artwork it is, 15%, 20 maybe, you know, and he didn't have to. He chose to. And again, what he's painting is American life, American labor, and he includes the African Americans in that. Not always, but occasionally. uplifting them, let's say, or glorifying or whatever. But he is showing their hard life. Again, many of them were working in cotton fields, and Tom showed that. But then again, you have that jazz musician one as well. So
yeah, and if you compare it to other, like say Hollywood, right? Hollywood's completely leaving blacks out of its movies. I would say novelists of that time, there's some black characters, but not very many. So it's really, I give him credit for that. Marcia has in chat saying, my opinion of him has changed. It seems like he did have a mission to portray African Americans in art with purpose and either education in mind. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, what's his intent? I feel like he does want people to confront the racism that he sees in the times that he lives.
yeah. Yeah, and Tom Benton was a member of the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union.
Yeah, that really says a lot. Other folks want to, anyone want to unmute and share some thoughts?
I really enjoyed this, and I'm grateful for this knowledge. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
So like I said, I
we're-
really wanted to give some context, some education. For the most part, I tried to keep my opinions out of it. We didn't have quite as much time for discussion as I was hoping. There's a lot to cover, and as you saw, I had to skip several things, but I apologize for that. But it's hard to do this program because it is so broad. I mean, when I first started thinking about doing this program, I was like, well, there's not going to be much there. And then as I got into it, I'm like, oh, there's a lot, and there's a whole lot of artwork that I left out that I just couldn't get to. And I had to pick and choose, sorts of things. So, so it's hard to do the program in an hour, but I appreciate everybody's patience and bearing with me. So, and I hope it was educational.
This is great stuff, Steve. And I'll just quickly say, we're very lucky to have Steve coming to us from Kansas City. I was connected with Steve from a mutual friend we have, Bernice Iwamoto, who she's a fellow guide at one of the local museums. And she's like very passionate about these Zoom art programs. And she came across you, Steve, and then said, you guys need to talk. And so, Steve, this is their second time coming on Art Viewing Adventures. And, I just think I'm really impressed with the amount of work you did to put this thing together. I feel like you've really tapped into a great subject. So I hope you'll be giving this presentation to lots of other people. I feel like you're giving us this information, not just as someone who is an art historian, but also as a historian. Like you've given a great deal of historic context, including I especially appreciated the tellings about all the lynchings that had happened around the area where he grew up in Missouri. I think that's really, really important.
That for me, that kind of went back to that say their name movement, as best we can. Some of them, we don't know their names. But.
Yeah. Sherry's asking about the other presentation we did. I don't know if we recorded that or not. I'll have to go back and check the archive.
We did. That was his Life in Murals presentation, I believe.
Okay, we should go, in Murals is we did. Okay, Jennifer's saying we did. So I'll go find a link to that and maybe put that in my Friday email. Those of you who get my weekly emails, I'll have hopefully have this presentation up on YouTube by Friday and make that available to you. It's a great job, Steve. We're really, really thrilled to have you on Art Viewing Adventure. I'm seeing some folks say the same thing in chat.
Thank you.
Really, really great job on a very important topic. And, if anybody gets the chance, if you're in Kansas City, you got to go by the Thomas Hart Home and Studio State Historic Site, where Steve is a docent in what's your exact title there, Steve?
I'm the site administrator.
Yeah. We had a wonderful time when we visited you. So, Steve, thank you so much. Hope to see you again in the near future. And everybody, this is actually our last show of 2022. We will be back in January, and I think our next program will be about the Joan Brown exhibition at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, which is fantastic.